Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here tonight and welcome to, I think this is technically an Out of the Archives event with the History Project and Ranger Maci Mark. Before I introduce Maci, I have a couple of announcements and some info about the History Project. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are Boston's LGBTQ+ community archives, and it is our mission to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ+ history. We have over 250 collections in the archives. We just moved all of those collections from our former office on Stanhope Street to our new office on Boylston Street. So it'll be a couple of months before we can have researchers in again. But I do encourage you to please check us out on our website and browse our digital collections to get a sense of all of the LGBTQ history that is part of Boston and Massachusetts history. I have a plug. Next week, we will be hosting an Out of the Archives event with author Scott Bain, who has written the book A Union Like Ours, the love story of F.O. Matheson and Russell Cheney. F.O. Matheson was an American literature scholar based at Harvard. Cheney was a painter, and the book and talk is about Bain's research on their relationship with one another. And so I will put that link in the chat for you. And then finally, I just have a quick call for support. First of all, for anyone who has donated tonight to help support our work, thank you so much for your support and your ongoing support of our work. We're a volunteer and community-driven organization, so donations in any amount help us to continue to do the work that we do. And I will put a link also in the chat to our donation page if you are feeling generous this evening. Back when we did this in person, we used to literally pass a hat around the room, which is less easy to do on Zoom. And with that, I'm very excited to introduce you all to Ranger Maci Mark and their new Boston Marriage to Marriage Equality Tour. Maci is a seasonal park ranger at Boston African American National Historic Site, and they work at Faneuil Hall leading Black Heritage Tours, Enemies to the Country Tours, and have worked on developing the Boston Marriages to Marriage Equality LGBTQ+ History Tour. All right, Maci, take it away.
So thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to be talking about the Boston Marriage to Marriage Equality Tour. So yeah, as Joan said, I'm a seasonal park ranger at Boston African American National Historic Site. We have mostly wrapped up our seasons of tours this year. So I've been able to really just be working on the Boston Marriage to Marriage Equality Tour the past few weeks. And so thank you all for your interest in it, for joining me here today. And so kind of the game plan of what I heard you guys might want to hear about is I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the tour, kind of what the tour is, and also a little background of like how we got to the tour that we have today, and kind of the development process that went into that, because at least I find that pretty interesting and hopefully you do too. Also, I love questions, so feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on them either as we're going or I'll answer them at the end. I'm aiming for this talking part to be about 45, maybe 50 minutes, and then I can get to your questions or we can have more of a discussion kind of about Boston Marriage to Marriage Equality. I also do want to give a heads up that the name might change in the future. That is actually something me and my colleagues are workshopping. And we did have, so if you, getting ahead of myself there. This tour is going to eventually be recorded and go up on the National Park Service app to be a tour that is offered year round where you can just go and walk it and do it yourself. We were lucky enough to be able to offer this tour back in October for LGBT History Month, which was wonderful. And hopefully next year for Pride Month, keep an eye out. We will hopefully be able to offer in-person walking tours of this tour again in June. With that, let's get started. Let me share my screen. There we go. You guys can see that? Yep, let me just start my presentation. Great. There is a CPR class also happening in the same building as me, so let's hope that they don't make too much noise. Okay, so again, Boston Marriage to Marriage Equality. This tour is really meant to be looking at the queer history of Beacon Hill, and also the greater Boston area. So on a map, if we were to do this in person, we would actually be starting in Boston Common at the corner of Charles and Beacon Street, right by the Starbucks over there. When we did this in person, we had to brave the brunch crowds, but we all did it. We all made it through, did not lose a single person on the tour to brunch. And so we are starting there because of, one, how essential Boston Common is to the history of Boston, but also because it is essential to the LGBT history of this area, as that is where for 20 years that is where Boston Pride marches ended, and that's where there was festivals and celebrations, and it's still where the queer community gathers here in Boston, because this is actually, the History Project actually had their own event there this summer by the bandstand. I was lucky enough to be able to attend that. So it is still an ongoing site of community gathering. But the gay history here in Boston goes back quite far. The first instance that we can actually find of a gay person on the record in Boston was actually in 1762 from a woman named Alice Paul. She shows up in the town meeting minutes for a crime she committed. She is found, and I'm going to read you the quote here, guilty of giving frequent, secret, and unseasonable entertainment in her household to lewd, lascivious, and notorious persons of both sexes. She's also written up for selling alcohol out of her home. But this is very interesting because this is the first time that you can find someone who is accused of being deviant and lewd towards both sexes. And oftentimes, and I know this crowd today is one who knows how far gay history goes back. That's why we're all here today. But oftentimes people don't realize how far back gay history goes. It was here in the 1700s. There's stories of what was called female husbands at the time, from where there's a assigned female at birth person who would dress and act as a man, and they'd get married and live their lives that way. And there'd be stories of that would actually cross the Atlantic from England and make their way over here to be reported in newspapers. So gay people have always existed and have continued to always exist. But here in Boston, this is Alice Paul marks the first person to be able to show up in this way. And it's interesting when we try to consider how you find queer, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people in history, because of the way that our language and our terms have changed so much over time. And that's why for this tour, when I refer to people who don't necessarily label themselves, I'm going to be using the word queer to refer to them, because that is a more general word and refers to someone who deviates from the norm. And I don't want to go back through history and assign labels to someone, especially when our labels mean something different than what they would have meant at the time. Okay, so we have that foundation here of understanding how far back the queer history goes here in Boston. And then next, we are going to be examining the Charles Street Meeting House, which that has a radical history itself. First built in 1804, it was always a site of challenges and change. As one of the original congregation members, Charles Gilbert, challenged the congregation to have desegregated seating, because at the time they had segregated seating of white families were able to rent pews, and Black families had to go up in the gallery. Well, Charles Gilbert brought a family down to him, a Black family down to sit in his pew with him. And this caused quite the ruckus. He was actually kicked out of church, and he went and founded Tremont Temple, which is down still on Tremont Street. So Charles Street Meeting House has always had this kind of radical, challenging history. And this becomes especially true in 1968 when Reverend Randy Gibson comes here to Charles Street Meeting House as it's a Universalist Unitarian church. Here, he helps make the Charles Street Meeting House and the Unitarian church there a welcoming place for the gay community. They do this through, one, hosting dances, but they also support groups there, like the Gay Community News, which we have the first issue up here on the screen. It was first published on June 17th, 1973. And Gay Community News was quite important as it was the first newspaper. Well, it started as a 4-page newsletter, became a 16-page newspaper. that was for the gay community by the gay community. And Charles Street Meeting House supported them both by giving them space. The editors physically met and stuffed envelopes in the back of Charles Street Meeting House. But also they financially supported them. They gave them the money to get on their feet and to be able to support this community, support the gay community in this way. The Gay Community News organization would go on to become quite the reach. They were operated for 20 years up until 1992, when they eventually closed due to financial issues, and then they were revived in 1996 as a magazine. But they were essential for the reach of the community and for being the first of its kind, but also for collecting information. They were essential in AIDS education when that crisis was happening, but also for just bringing the community together. But Charles Street Meeting House did more than just financially and also give the space. They also hosted the first gay dance in Boston that was publicly advertised as a gay dance. Because at the time, it was illegal for same-sex couples to dance together in bars. And so Charles Street Meeting House was able to offer that space. And it was quite successful. It was actually, you can see here on this flyer here, the Love is All, which is actually from the History Project's collection, the advertising the dance there. And this is meant as a commemoration of the Christopher Street Liberation events, which was what we now call the Stonewall riots. And while they did have the first publicly advertised gay dance, they could actually have no more because Mayor Kevin White shut it down because neighbors complained that it was too lewd or too out there or changed the neighborhood too much. But Charles Street Meeting House was able to support the community in this way. And lastly, especially because in late 1970s, they were actually able to offer the first LGBT youth group that was federally funded. Reverend Brandy Gibson was able to get a federal grant and was able to support the community in this way by bringing in youth advocates and helping train the future generation of youth advocates. But it was really known as the heart of the community. It hosted theaters, productions, workshops, and it also was a site of celebration because after in 1971, the second year that Pride happened in Boston, the route was changed to march down Charles Street and past the Charles Street Meeting House because they knew that there would be welcoming faces there, that would be a welcome place for the parade to take place. And this is also one of the significances of Charles Street. It was kind of known as the gay neighborhood of Boston at the time because of both what was happening there in the community, but also because this is where people flocked because it was a safe space. Now we're going to jump back a little bit in time. We're going to be talking about, well, we've just talked about what life was like potentially as a gay person in the 1970s. We're going to now talk a little bit about what life would have looked like as a queer person in the 1800s. And we're going to first start by talking about both Boston marriages and romantic friendships. Up here on the screen, you're looking at Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, who are kind of the couple when it comes to Boston marriages. Boston marriages is a term that refers to two people of the same sex who live together as if they are married, even if they are not legally married. And Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett are a couple who do so. The term Boston marriage actually comes from a book called The Bostonians, written by Henry James in the mid-1800s. In this book, he lightly bases off of Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett as kind of his model of a couple. And so Annie Fields was wife to Jack Fields, the editor for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. She helped him run his editing business, and eventually Jack dies after they're married for 10 years. And Annie Fields essentially remarries Sarah Orne Jewett and kind of takes over the editing business. She creates a vibrant literary circle around her and is able to continue on. Sarah Orne Jewett is a writer, and she lives up in Maine. And here they are in their Charles Street home, which is currently a JP Licks in a parking garage. But we have this photo, and you can see both of them reading in the library there. So they effectively functioned as a married couple. They lived together. They held they attended social gatherings together. They'd summer out in Maine in Sarah's home out there, which is actually currently a historic home museum. And they'd come back into Boston in the winter and live here in Annie's home, hosting salons for a vast literary community that flocked around them. What's interesting about them is both their ability to be both publicly and privately out, because they were accepted within their literary circle. And the book was based off of them, the Bostonians. So it's very well aware of who they are and how they lived. But this is also a position of immense privilege. They are two wealthy white women who did not need to marry for financial for financial support. They were able to support themselves, and that's why they were able to stay unmarried and able to stay together in this way. But this isn't the only way that queer couples existed in the 1800s, because there's also something called romantic friendships. Romantic friendships is an intentionally ambiguous term, in that it means, or it's referring to two people of the same sex who are in a important relationship to each other, potentially the most important relationship that they would ever have. And while we will never potentially know if they were romantically involved or if they were just a very intense friendship, it is an example of someone who is deviating from a heterosexual norm in a potential way that people could have existed in outside of the norm at the time. One of the most famous couples, and one of my favorite couples to talk about as romantic friendships, is actually Charles Sumner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So those are names that you guys might know for various other reasons. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote the famous Midnight Ride. He has the National Historic Site out in Cambridge, and he has a long legacy here in Boston. So does Charles Sumner. You might know him most from the when he's caned in the Senate, or also for his work in helping desegregate Boston public schools when he sues the city alongside Robert Morris. And he is a kind of a staple of Beacon Hill. But Charles Sumner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow were in a romantic friendship together. They were known to spend almost all their time together. If you were to go through Longfellow's journal, you'd find that out of 10 days, Charles Sumner was there for 8 of them. And they were in a very intense relationship, and they meant everything to each other. Unfortunately for Charles Sumner, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow married Fanny Appleton. And Charles Sumner writes about how devastated he is, and he feels like his relationship will never be the same, and that he's losing his beloved friend, Henry. But luckily for him, Fanny Appleton welcomes him into essentially the Longfellow's new family. Charles Sumner is even invited on their honeymoon in Europe, and goes and joins them for a portion of it. But Charles Sumner is also welcome at their family, at their home. He dines there at least once a week. And when he is there, he's often seated at the head of the table. But this isn't the only romantic friendship that Charles Sumner engaged in, because you also see Samuel Gridley Howe up there, who was also an abolitionist, but also would go on to be the first headmaster of the Perkins School for the Blind. But Samuel Gridley Howe and Charles Sumner also had a romantic friendship with each other. But unfortunately for Charles Sumner, when Samuel Gridley Howe married Julia Ward, their relationship kind of took a hit. Charles Sumner had the same fears he had when regarding that he'd now be cut out of Henry's life. But unfortunately, Samuel was not as good at managing all of his relationships, and Julia was not a fan of it either. Samuel would often go hot and cold on Charles Sumner, one time being welcoming, other times being inviting. And Julia, Samuel's wife, would often complain about the fact that she feels that Samuel does not love her as much as he cares for Charles Sumner. I actually have a quote to read to you that Howe wrote to Sumner in 1848. He says, "When my heart is full of joy or sorrow, it turns to you and yearns for your sympathy. In fact, as Julia often says, Sumner ought to have been a woman and you to have married her. But I should not agree to this in any monogammatic land, for Julia is my love as a wife." Howe struggles with his relationship, and eventually Charles and Samuel grow distant, and the fear of losing that relationship does come true to Charles Sumner. And so while we might never know how Charles Sumner, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, or Samuel Gridley Howe identified, they all engaged in relationships that could have potentially been queer. And I'm not going to try to, or I don't want to assign them labels, because we don't know what this meant to them at the time, but we do know just how important they are. And another thing I think interesting to consider as well when we're thinking about these romantic friendships and Boston marriages is why we're able to know about some and not others. Because as we were talking about Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, they were much more public. People knew, they hosted people as a couple. But in the case of Charles, Henry, and Samuel, this is often not talked about. Like, we know, we talk about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Charles Sumner quite a bit here in Boston, but not necessarily their relationship with each other. And this is part of why it's hard to identify queer people throughout history, because of the ways they've been covered up. And this is partially because of their own doing for their safety. Howe writes to Sumner in 1852, and he says, let me read you the quote here. I have made a rule lately, put in the only place such notes of yours as might be disagreeable to you to have seen by unfriendly eyes on the grate. It costs me something to burn a piece of paper that has been hallowed to my eye by the impression of your hand, but I do it. I have no confidant for such things, no, not one. You can see how dire here Howe is about worrying about the relationship potentially being found out by even political enemies of Charles Sumner, as we know he has lots of those, of kind of what it would mean to potentially deviate from the norm, but also what this kind of confirms of that they are doing something that they're hiding. What does that mean for their relationship? And so while there is others that are able to be more private or more public, and we can't ever assign labels, it's also just interesting to consider what it meant to deviate as the norm, and even if that meant you were queer or not. Because especially in the case of Edmonia Lewis, she is of Chippewa descent and was born in upstate New York and had a Chippewa mother and an African-American father. And she was quite a famous artist. She was a sculptor, and she eventually leaves the United States to go study in Rome after she feels like her gender and race holds her back here in the United States. She had actually been expelled from Oberlin her senior year after being accused of poisoning some classmates, which she claims she never did, but her accusers believe she did. So she left for Rome and she joined a literary circle there hosted by Harriet Hosmer and Charlotte Cushing. Charlotte Cushing was famous as an actor for playing Romeo and playing male characters. And they were known to, Charlotte and Harriet were also known for possibly engaging in Boston marriages. So Edmonia existing in this community and potentially being part of it, but also she deviates from the norm, and that is why we could potentially place her in these communities. As she never married, she would occasionally spread rumors about the fact that she was potentially engaged, maybe to offset the chance or to offset the rumors that she was in a Boston marriage or part of this community because of the potential implications it could have on her career or other relationships. And again, this is just one factor of how it's hard to identify people, but also how relationships have changed and our understanding of gender and sexuality has changed as well. I also want to note that the people that we know about are often wealthy white people. And this is because those are the people whose items most often end up in museums and in archives and are preserved and passed down, but also because of the privilege that they are able to exist authentically in the way that they want to. Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields would not have been able to live together as a couple if they were not financially stable enough to be unmarried. And so this is an important way and lens of viewing queer people of the past. So now I want to talk about someone who's kind of at a transitional time. This is Prescott. This is Prescott Townsend. He was born in 1898, and he lives up until 1973. So he is just on the cusp of when Beacon Hill is changing from being a Black abolitionist community to becoming more of an immigrant community, but also a community filled with the gay community. He is from a very wealthy family here in Boston, and he attends Harvard College. He graduates in the Naval War class of 1918, essentially means he leaves Harvard to go enlist in the Navy and serve in World War I. And he knew he was homosexual from a young age. And I'm confident calling him homosexual and gay because those are words he used to identify himself. But he graduated, he came back here to Boston. Then he went and spent a little bit of time in Bohemia in France, kind of seeing that artist lifestyle. And he came back and he wanted to create that artist community here in Boston. So he actually buys up a whole bunch of property. He opens the Barn Theater Troupe, where he supports a theater troupe just down the street from where he lives. And he wants to create a thriving artist community. He does up until the Great Depression hits. He loses almost all of his property. He keeps a house on Lindell Street and on Phillips Street, which are actually connected by an underground tunnel. And that is where he lives for almost the rest of his life. But after the Great Depression, he continues to help create this thriving artist and eventually gay activist community. Because in 1943, he is arrested for indecent acts, being caught kissing another man in a doorway in Beacon Hill. and he is arrested and thrown into the Deer Island prison for 18 months. And this is a life-changing, both because it publicly outs him in a way he was not ready for and did not get to do himself, but also because it also gives him his freedom in a way. He had told his family that he was gay from a young age, and they were fine with it, but they just told him to be careful because of the social and political implications of what it could mean for his family. And when he was thrown into jail, his family had the chance to come petition to potentially get a shorter sentence or get him out of jail, and none of them showed up. And when he gets out of jail 18 months later, his name is removed from all of the social registers that was previously on, that he was connected through his wealthy family. And so he's essentially starting over and has to find a new community. And he finds one in the gay community. He becomes a staunch activist, being willing to be more publicly out than almost anyone else because he had already been pushed out. But also because he is financially stable, he was still on good terms with his family, even if they didn't show up for him. And so he had financial stability. He was still from a very wealthy family. He owned his own home and was able to rent out rooms to people. So he became a important figure in this transitional time here in Boston. He helped found the Boston chapter of the Maci Society, which is one of the first gay rights organizations founded out in Los Angeles and eventually makes its way to the East Coast. He would actually go on to clash with the leadership of the Maci Society because many of the members, including the leadership, were closeted still. They did not want to have to deal with both the social and political consequences. They could lose their jobs if they came out, and they would lose their families. Well, he had that safety net. So he actually ends up leaving the Maci Society because of this clash of him being willing to be out and wanting to push others to come out as well. But he's still an important member of the community. And he also helps the Daughter of Builtless chapter form up here in Boston as well, again, hosting meetings in his home. And he lives here in Beacon Hill up until 1971, when his house actually catches on fire and he is forced to move out. And this is also one reason that we don't know as much about him as we would hope to, because most of his items and his documents are burned with everything in his house. And his house is still standing. You can go by it today. It's actually just on the Black Heritage Trail. It's just across the street from Lewis and Harriet Hayden home, which again positions him in an interesting place of a transitional moment because he's before the gay liberation movement. He will live up until 1973, where he'll see just the beginning of what is to come of the fight that he's been fighting for almost his entire life. But he's living in the memory of this strong Black community in Beacon Hill and hearing the stories about those abolitionists who fought for abolition here in Boston and also nationwide and what they were willing to do. The photo on the left is of him in his Harvard days, and the photo on the right is of him towards the end of his life. He was known as an eclectic old man, and he actually was known for never owning a refrigerator, a TV, a microwave, and was very much kind of your eclectic old hippie in the neighborhood. And so he was able to help form this community and transition the community from what it was in the 1800s. And his life is a good example of that, of being closeted, but then of eventually transitioning to a publicly out sphere. And now I don't have slides for it because I don't have images of it. But what's also important to when you're considering the gay community in Boston is the bars and the bars in Boston. Most notably, the next one would be on our route would actually be Sporters. It is just down the street from where Prescott Townsend lives. And I don't have a photo of it because it actually, well, it's still there today. It's no longer Sporters, but it didn't really have a big name on it on the outside. It was kind of low key at its time, but it was an important part of the community as well because it's where it was known as a cheap place to get a drink, but also because of the types of communities that could form there, it was more of an anonymous place that you could go. You didn't necessarily have to identify yourself or be part of a community in a different way. Also down the street from right here is also the Old West Church, which is an important place as well, similarly to the Charles Street Meeting House. It is a place of radical origins in that it was a place of challenging and it eventually became a public library, but in 1960s, it transitioned back to being a church. And in 1970, it was where GLAAD was founded by John Ward here in Boston. And this was an organization to help fight against discrimination against the gay community here in Boston. Because at this time, there was a lot of raids on places of gay community, but also because there was raids on the Boston Public Library bathrooms, which were known as kind of cruising spaces, and it was known as a specific attack on the community. Oh, you have a photo of sporters. Thank you. From the inside. Yeah, so GLAAD is still an organization today, and they've been essential in the fight for equal marriage. They actually had the goal of 6 by 12, so all 6 New England states by 2012. And they did accomplish their goal, although a few months late, they got all 6 by 2013, although I think it was like March when they got it, so we're going to give it to them. They got 6 by 12. We're actually going to talk about marriage equality and what that means and the fight to get it in a little bit. Now I want to talk about kind of the working class community here. So you guys, up here I have an image of Scully Square, which many of you guys have been there today as Government Center. So Scully Square was kind of the commercial area of downtown Boston. It was first a high-end shopping district, but then as it was a place of where commuters came in, it kind of became just a shopping spot and eventually one for more of a working class family, and eventually became an entertainment district. And this is kind of happens at the same time as World War II, when there was a lot of influx of young men coming in because we have the Charlestown Navy Yard where I am today, which is also entering the nightlife scene. So Scully Square kind of transitions from being a theater district and an entertainment district to a nightlife, kind of a red light district, when the Howard Athenaeum actually starts changing from being a theater showing movies to hosting burlesque shows. This was very popular, and so many other theaters quickly adopted it, and it kind of became known as that's when it got the nickname, or became known as the red light district. And this was an important place of community for a much more working class side of the Boston gay community. As we've already talked about the wealthy community, but since Scully Square was on the outskirts and they were considered outside the norms, it was a safe place for working class gay, lesbian, transgender people to gather. These burlesque shows were known for having male or female impersonators, which we would now call drag kings or queens. And it was a safe space of community because since they were already on the outskirts, they didn't have to worry about ostracizing themselves. It was a place of gathering. It was also flooded with soldiers who were, for the first time, away from home and able to explore other aspects of their identity and nightlife and what that could mean for them. But Scully Square became a victim of urban renewal. That is why it is a government center today. It is a flat plaza of brick, and it's now where City Hall is. But its agenda of being on urban renewal is partially due to the fact that it was home to this working class queer community. And I'm going to read you a quote from the city councilor Freddie Lagone, kind of about the motivations of kind of wiping out this whole area. He says, "We will be better off without these incubators of homosexuality and indecency and a bohemian way of life. I tell you right now, we will be better off without it, and if we accomplish nothing else, at least we will uproot this cancer in one area of the city." This is very strong and angry language, and he is very clear about the agenda of he wants to get rid of the homosexuals of the gay community. And they are successful. Scully Square is wiped out. There is a plaque still left up there. I have actually been unable to find it. I believe it's tucked away behind the gates or the fences to the construction still happening on City Hall Plaza. And really the only thing left of Scully Square is if you were to go in the government center T-stop. If you go down towards the blue line, you'll see Scully Square under the mosaic and the tile still down there. And that's really all that's left. And I want to end kind of our story of looking at this community by both talking about City Hall and Faneuil Hall, as these are important places of both victory and success for the gay community here. This is because in May 17th, 2004 at City Hall, the first same-sex marriage licenses are given out. This is after the Goodrich versus The Department of Public Health court case makes it all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and Goodridge wins. The plaintiffs of this case are given the first marriage licenses at City Hall. They line up and Mayor Thomas Menino meets them at the door, lets them in. They're actually not the first people in the state to get it. In Cambridge, they actually opened up City Hall at midnight to start giving out same-sex marriage licenses. But this was the first state in the United States to offer marriage equality, and it wouldn't be nationwide up until 2015 with the Oberfeld case. Sorry, doing a lot of talking today. I get tongue-tied. And this is an important victory that the community has been fighting for since the founding of the Maci Society. This is what GLAAD was working towards, and what the gay rights advocates like Prescott Townsend have been working for their whole life, is to have these recognition, these protections. And also from City Hall was a place of protests and gathering, because during the AIDS crisis, this is where the gay community would gather to hold vigils and protest the fact that the city knew what was happening but was not acting on it at all. This image here is from 1983, when people are leaving the gay and lesbian town meeting that's happening at Faneuil Hall to go host a vigil in front of City Hall. So these gay and lesbian town meetings were started at Faneuil Hall in 1977. And these were the chance for gay, lesbian, transgender people to insert themselves into the long legacy of Faneuil Hall. So Faneuil Hall was built in 1742 and is known as the Cradle of Liberty for its role in the American Revolution. It is a host to numerous types of debates, rallies, political meetings. And in 1977, for the first time, gay and lesbian people and transgender people are able to be represented here in Faneuil Hall, being part of it and expanding, if you will, the Cradle of Liberty. These meetings are hosted in good old New England tradition. I'm going to read you the quote that was published in their pamphlet in 1989 about it. They say that town meeting has been a New England tradition for centuries, exemplifying the spirit of grassroots citizens' democracy, which is this region's heritage. New Englanders have long gathered to address the issues facing them, both large and small, in an open, participatory, and lively forum. The model is one of the citizenry taking direct responsibility for their own lives and affairs. Using New England tradition with the more modern right of lesbian and gay pride, the lesbian and gay community of Greater Boston has held its own town meetings in historic Faneuil Hall for years. These meetings would go on to be held in Faneuil Hall for about 20 years. They eventually move out in about 1992 for various reasons, but are an important part of its legacy, as they're continuing in the tradition and allowing them or including themselves in this history for the first time. So over the course of this tour, we talk about communities and how they've changed and how people have been able to exist and represent themselves over time. And now I want to end the tour in this talk today by considering how we fit into that legacy. Our goal here today is to continue on and tell the story of this legacy of how we got here today and how we have the rights that we have. Charles Sumner, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Annie Fields, and Sarah Orne Jewett, or even Alice Paul would not begin to be able to imagine the world that we live in today and how we are able to live authentically as ourselves. So I just want to leave you with the question of considering how we can fit into this expanded Cradle of Liberty, but also how we can expand this community to include more people and continue on the legacy of people who have been fighting for their rights to exist and live authentically as themselves. Let me just do a time check. So that is kind of what the Boston Marriage to Marriage Equality tour covers, essentially. We're going from that time and community, and I do want to see if there's any questions before. I also want to talk about kind of why we chose these sites, and kind of what entailed going into the research of this. But I just want to check, is there any questions about anything we've talked about? And also if I can get a time check. I'm in a room with no clocks, it turns out.
Okay, so it is 6:41.
Right.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but if anyone, we can use the hand raise function if anyone does have a question. And to get that, you just click reactions and then raise hand, and I can make sure that you are unmuted. But if nobody has a question right this moment, I think you could tell us a bit about how you chose the sites. Oh no, Jill. Okay. Jill, you can ask a question.
Thank you. Hey, Maci. So obviously, as a walking tour, you're kind of bound by geography. You have to go in the order that it makes sense to move a group around. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are then to developing a tour that in many ways is very chronological when you're talking about the evolution of like social attitudes and beliefs and customs, and where in many ways chronology lets you better trace the connections and like see how things are building on each other, but in the form of a walking tour you can't do that.
Yeah, that is honestly been one of our biggest issues. And I'll pull up, I actually have a map right here that I've pulled up to answer questions like this. Can you guys see my mouse? And I'll show you kind of the evolution, kind of the issues we ran into. Can you guys see my mouse when I wiggle it?
Yep, you're all the way down in the bottom left corner. At least I
Yes.
can see it. It's
Yeah,
a little
cool.
small, but
okay. Yeah, so that is, because it's a very good question, and thank you for asking it, because that is what we've struggled with. Because I would prefer to talk about Boston marriages and romantic friendships before we hit the Charles Street Meeting House, because we have to kind of jump around about 100 years, which doesn't make sense chronologically, and it's a little confusing when you have to jump, and I would prefer it chronological. But we've tried to deal with that by tying it all together with our essential question that we've tied this tour together is, what does this community look like over time, and how does this community change? Eventually, community is the biggest theme. So we try to tie it together by considering how these communities would have connected. So like, how would the Charles Street Meeting House community have connected to the literary community that Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields connect to? And this has been a very brief tour. The walking tour and the audio tour is going to be 90 minutes. So I did leave out some of the detail that would maybe help connect that a little bit. But yeah, that is our constraints. And that's actually been what's changed the most about this tour over the, honestly, 3 months I've been working on it. So as I said, it starts over in the corner of Charles Street and Beacon Hill. When we initially started this, we were actually going to start at Faneuil Hall. So we were going to reverse it, and we were going to end in the Boston Common. But eventually we decided that chronologically it would make more sense to start in the Boston Common, because while Charles Street Meeting Place is out of time, it otherwise essentially goes in a relatively decent order of starting in the 1800s and ending in the 2000s. And the landscape is also limited stuff, because we actually weren't going to include Sporters, Sporters is right here, right on the corner of Cambridge Street and Joy Street. We weren't going to include it because our route at first did not take us past it. But eventually we saw how important it was to the story, and so we found a way to kind of wedge its way in. But also because it also fits chronologically there. And we've also made other changes like that over at City Hall and Faneuil Hall. We originally had those as 2 different stops, and we've combined them into one, just because it makes sense both time-wise, and because the plaza of Faneuil Hall is always crowded and it's hard to hear over there. So other logistical issues. We've also had to leave out other things because of it. There's a lot of other people, like there's the James Otis house right over here, who I believe they touch on queer history of there as well. But it, again, timing wise and also chronologically, that's earlier, I believe. So it doesn't quite fit in because Old West by then we're in the 70s. We actually we wanted to include the combat zone, which is right down here. I think right around, not around downtown Crossing, but on the map would be down there. And we just couldn't figure out how to make a route that would work because it's just so far out of the way. And that was one of our losses of it just isn't going to be factored in. And maybe in the future we'll find a way to include it or have its own part of the story. Like, we know it's there and we do talk about it when we talk about the nightlife scene, because it is important when talking about Scully Square, but it's just something that we were unable to include. Yeah, thank you for that question. You kind of launched me into the top.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a common issue. We have that also on the Black Heritage Trail and the Freedom Trail, on Enemies to Country Trail. Faneuil Hall is really the only place that you can do chronologically because you're only in one place. You get to decide what time you're talking about. I see more questions. Oh. Where the first lesbian bar was? Oh, Tremont Street. Yeah, we were considering also including things on Tremont Street because 22 Bromfield Street is where Gay Community News' headquarters were. But we again couldn't figure out how to get a route that would take you, because we also don't want to be taking people on a 3-hour tour. No one wants that. I love a good tour, but not a 3 hours, 5-mile jaunt. So we're also limited by time in that way, because if we were going to do the combat zone, we would also stop by Tremont Street, or 22 Bromfield Street, which is right next to Tremont Street, which also has various other things there. So yeah, time is also an important factor there. We try to keep it tight 90 minutes. Yeah, I see a question from Morgan. Okay, so that's a good question. I do not have a list of all the tour stops yet, because we are actually still finalizing them. When we gave the tour, or when I gave the tour back in early October, we had, I believe it was 9 to 10 stops. So we started at corner of Charles and Beacon Street. We stopped at the Charles Street Meeting House. We stopped on the corner of the street up on Revere Street. We then went to Prescott Townsend, Old West. The first one did not have the scooters bar. We walked past it, or Sportus. We walked right past and we talked about it. We didn't stop there. And the second time we stopped there. And then we went to Scully Square. And the first time we actually combined Scully Square and City Hall, because it was also the day of the Women's March. And so we couldn't get up to City Hall because they were marching by, and we didn't want to intersect with them because they're pretty loud over there. So yeah, the being able to give the tours were really interesting, actually, because we were using them as both wanting to give them, but also as a test run of like what would actually work for an audio tour, and hear that people's questions. Because every other time that we've published an audio tour, we haven't been able to get feedback on it in the way of like, where are we unclear? What more do people want to be included? Because you publish them and you don't get the same amount of feedback you would as an in-person tour. So actually some of my colleagues came along and we were making notes of people's questions or what they wanted to hear about so that we could incorporate them into the audio tours. We're going to record sometime in the next few weeks to put it up. So there's not a finalized list. If you want the list, it will actually be up on, so once the audio tour is on the app, it's going to be listed out by each stop, and each stop is also going to have a place asset of why that stop is significant, and also tie it together geographically. Also because the way technology works in the National Park Service app, you need a place asset to have a stop. The tour, hoping in about a month it'll be up on the app. And so Morgan, you can look on there to get like the list of it, and I'll have a little information on that. I'll also put my email in the chat, and I'm more than happy to kind of send you a rough outline of stops if you're interested in that. If I think that answers your question. I also rambled on about other things there. Yeah, let me go back to the chat.
Yep, there's Mark has some info that they'd like to pass along.
Oh yeah.
And Mark, do you want me to have you unmuted, or would you like to email me? See, or here.
Here, I'm typing my email in. Gov. Just a warning though that my season does end in 2 weeks, so I will not get emails after 2 weeks, but you can always be in contact with Joan for.
Yeah, I have a little information that might be interesting. So I've been a member of Metropolitan Community Church out of Old West forever. And there's a lot of good information in a couple of books that were written. Reverend Nancy Wilson, who became the denomination lead for all of Metropolitan Community Church, started her ministry at the Old West Church out of CC Boston. And she has a book, Amazing Grace. And if you can find this book, there's a great deal of information in here about being an out lesbian clergy person at the 1970s. There's also information about some Boston marriages, people that came to the church in the early days, professing their love for one another. So it's quite interesting. The other thing I'd add is the Religious Coalition for Freedom to Marry was started by Reverend Dr. Joan Sanyuk out of Old West, again, MCC, and a Catholic priest who I do not know his name. And by the time 2004 came around, they had over 2,000 signatures of clergy
Oh, wow.
saying that they support same-sex marriage. So there is quite a bit of history with Old West Church and MCC Boston in particular that might be of interest. If there's an opportunity to sit with someone and chat, I could pass some information and you might be able to use some of it.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Because that is currently that's the stuff I'm working on right now. I'm trying to flesh it out, and so please shoot me an email and we can talk, and I will be looking up that book for sure. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. And Mark, I might also be reaching out to you about MCC and the history of MCC in Boston, because I think we have some materials from the Metropolitan Community Church. Marvin, who's on the History Projects board, is here, and I don't recall right off the top of my head. I know we have some dignity stuff. I know we have some freedom for the coalition. Freedom, religious. You just said the organization name, Mark. I'm sorry. It's been a very long week. Religious Coalition for the Freedom to Marry. So yeah, anyway, we are always interested in hearing more about people's personal history and the history of the places in which they are. Maci, do you want to tell us more about developing the tour, or do you want to? I have a couple questions for you too, but I don't want to derail you.
Oh no, I'm happy to hear your questions.
Yeah, I think, what was I gonna mention? I'm curious, because it is really hard. Beacon Hill has so much history on it, given that it is, we're talking Boston's coming up on our 400th anniversary this decade. We're 8 years away, but that comes fast. And there's so much history there that I'm curious, were there, when you were picking sites, did you have a certain time period in mind? Did you have a hard time winnowing down based on the really, large amount of information in this neighborhood? And I'm also, this is a two-part question, which is a terrible thing to do to a speaker, but my other sort of question is, when you're talking about the history of sexuality and deviancy, the history project, we talk about LGBTQ history all the time. It's part of, it's our job. Did you have any pushback from the National Park Service, or were there any topics that you shied away from talking about because you work for the government?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm gonna answer it in two parts, I think. So first, whittling it down has been the hardest part of this. So we are trying to make each stop be about 3 to 4 minutes. It is not 3 to 4 minutes at the moment when we've been reading them aloud to ourselves or done it. Because it's like you want to be so specific, and you want to include everything, because there's all these incredible quotes. But there's, again, I want to respect people's time. People are doing other things in Boston. Again, you don't want a 3-hour, 5-mile tour or maybe you do, but don't think the general public wants that. And so we whittled stuff down, and kind of our goal was to have something representative of each time, and also who to help connect it, and also what there's information about, because we have a lot of great quotes from Charles Sumner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Samuel Gridley Howe. There's a lot of information there to work with. Well, others there's much less. Like Edmonia Lewis, we made a point. We wanted to talk about her and her potential, because again, we will never know, but she is someone who's part of this community, even if on the outskirts, because of the friendships she had or the social circle she was in. So there's people who were we need them in this tour because of how, and we actually struggled with keeping Edmonia in, because she doesn't have a great place-based spot. We talk about her when we talk about Boston marriages and romantic friendships, because she is part of that circle, even if she wasn't ever physically at those locations. Although it's likely she went over to Sarah and Annie's house. She didn't live in Beacon Hill. The closest physical asset we have to her there is that she attended the 12th Baptist church there, which is down the street from the Hayden's home, which is down the street from Prescott Townsend. So that would be easy, but so there's people we made sure, but there's also people that were cut. And that kind of gets into your second question of what we could and couldn't talk about, because the combat zone is an interesting one. Because we first ran into the issue of figuring out how it fits in geographic wise of like, how do we get people all the way over here? And then how do we get them all the way over the other place? We ultimately ended up scrapping it because of that. But at the same time, we were checking in with supervisors about whether or not how to talk about it, because it is known as more of a nightlife red light district than Scollay Square. It was known as having a different crowd there and more illegal things happening there essentially. And we were ultimately told that we had to make it PG-13 because this is going to potentially be families coming on our tour for this. And so that is the only pushback, or I'm not going to call that pushback. That's the only limit they put on it, is to make it PG-13, which I feel like is a fair request for a public tour. And so that was tied into the combat zone being cut, both because we couldn't make it PG-13. You're cutting out a lot of that history, but also just geographic wise, you can't get people across Boston Common that quickly like that. And there's not a great route for that. But there has been only incredible support from the National Parks of Boston for this tour. A couple years ago, a couple of other rangers had tried to get it off the ground. Eric Hansen-Plass, Dave Santucci, and Theo Linger, to name a few people, have been trying to get it off the ground, and it just never ultimately came to fruition. There just wasn't necessarily the manpower at the time. This is the first year in a while that we've had since COVID, like full ranger, not full ranger. We're still a little bit understaffed, but more staffing than we've had years previous. So there's been more time. And actually, a lot of this was developed in the pandemic. So I actually have some resources here of articles that the National Park Service has published about a lot of what we were talking about today. And a lot of these were written during the pandemic because the rangers had time to research. So this is the groundwork for this tour has been being laid for a while. And I was just lucky enough to come in at the right time to be able to work on it and turn it into what it is. Because I'm being supported by countless colleagues. I'm the kind of the public person, because I've there's also an intern helping on this, and Megan and Katie Woods from the Digital Humanities team, or Digital Humanities and Innovation team, is also helping out on this. So there's a lot of support for it, and everyone's very excited to finally get this off the ground because it's been years of the work. The Charles Sumner Romantic Friendships and Era of Romantic Friendships. That one was actually supported by Longfellow. They helped us work on that one, and there's actually a video. But then, Prescott Townsend, Gay and Lesbian Town Meeting, that's all been written in the past few years. Charles Street Meeting House, I did that last year when I was an intern here. Continuing on. We haven't had pushback because our goal is to help here in the National Parks of Boston. We tell we call it the Trails to Freedom, both the Freedom Trail and the Black Heritage Trail tour. And this tour of telling the gay history is just expanding the Cradle of Liberty, expanding the story of Boston and who fits in and who is included in this story. The only limit I've really had is here with the National Park Service, we cannot talk about politics. We are a federal organization, and we are we don't deal in politics. So that's why we could also kind of stop in 2004. Because that gets a little too close to 2022 if you get any further than 2004 here in Boston. I think that answered the question.
Yeah, no, totally. And I copied all of these links, and I will send out to everyone who RSVP'd the links to the resources that NPS has written. I know I was Googling Prescott Townsend as you were talking about him, and was excited to see Theo and Megan.
Yeah.
And some other folks have all given presentations with us, and Dave Santucci and Eric Hansen-Plass are both lovely. And so it's really exciting to see this grow.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, is there anything else you'd like to share with us? And then I can open us up for some more questions. And then I know you need to be out of there by 7:30.
What time is it? Yeah, they're
It is 7:01.
Oh, we've got oops. I'll stop screen sharing.
Great.
I think the questions have all covered kind of what I was going to talk about with the tour. So I'm happy for more questions or to chat more about it, or hear people's thoughts. I'm also happy to tell more about kind of how the in-person versus the audio tour. I do want to plug, though, if people are going to head out once we start talking, though, that it's going to go up on the National Park Service app, and I think just about a month it'll be up. If you want to make sure you're aware when it goes up, check out our Instagram. We're going to be posting when it goes up, and we're going to have the resources up there because we're very excited to launch it. We were really hoping to get it up in October, but as we all know, things take a lot more time than you budget. And so it's going to go up in November instead. But,
Yeah, and October is Gay History Month. In the same way that June is Pride Month, we have gay history and are proud year round.
yes,
So
exactly.
it'll be exciting to see it. I was going to make a joke that if you want to do an after hours combat zone tour for the history project as a volunteer, we will absolutely let you do that. So long as no one does anything illegal on the tour that we know about.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be PG-13, but
Good to know.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so does anyone else have any other questions? Like I said, you can do the hand raise thing, or if you're on video, you can wave at me. And I'm happy to unmute you. Nope, we're quiet. We're all excited to download the app and take the tour.
I think we're going to record sometime in the next few weeks. It's a pretty fun, like they've set up, since we do a lot of audio tours here, we have a Freedom Trail, Black Haters Trail, a Women's Tour, an Underground Railroad Tour. That's new. We came out with that in September. We've got like a whole setup with the mic and everything, and we get like a whole bunch of us, like all the quotes will have different voices, and it's gonna be a nice setup.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it. And I will just say on behalf of the History Project, thank you so much, Maci, for sharing all of this work with us. It's so exciting to see. It's so exciting to see the National Park Service writ large talking about LGBTQ history in a way that they never have before, that I think it took until 2015 for Stonewall to become a National Historic Monument. If my years are right, I can usually get decade, and it's embarrassing that one's so close and I can't remember. But yeah, thank you for doing this work and for sharing it with us. And I just want to say to everyone here on behalf of the History Project, thank you for spending some time with us tonight to talk about LGBTQ history. We'll be back again next week talking with author Scott Bain about his book on F.O. Matheson and F.O. Matheson's partner, whose name escapes me, but you will have to come to the event next week to learn more about him. And Morgan is asking for a link to the tours.
Oh, which tours? Because we have a lot. Are you talking about because this one doesn't have a link yet. It is still in production. Yeah. The best place to look for it again would probably be our Instagram or Facebook, or you could just religiously check the app.
Is that the BOAF Instagram?
Yes, BOAF, the Boston African American National Historic Site.
There we go. We're gonna just pop to the BOAF Instagram into the chat. But yeah, great. Well, everyone have a lovely evening. Enjoy the nice weather while it lasts here in Massachusetts, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you guys for coming.